Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Gloria Zamolik, and I am a member of the Eastside Huddle. Huddles started over the country after the presidential Women's March after the last presidential election, and to carry on the action beyond just the political act we made in doing the march. So we are a nonpartisan group of women who share values of respect, dignity, and justice for all human beings. Our goal is to support political candidates who reflect these values and represent Iowans with honesty and integrity. So with that in mind, we are inviting Democratic candidates for senator to online meetings with us to help inform our fellow Iowans about these candidates and encourage them to participate in the upcoming primary election on June 2nd. So tonight, Cal Woods is with us. We're so happy he agreed to join us. So Cal, I'm just gonna let you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we have some general questions to ask you, and then after that, maybe more specific questions can be asked.
Very good. All questions are fair game. Thank you, Gloria. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for hosting the event. My name is Cal Woods. I'm a candidate for United States Senate. I grew up on a Lynn County hog farm, just about 20 miles east of Cedar Rapids, just north of Mount Vernon. My dad was also a factory machinist at Universal Engineering in Cedar Rapids. He was a member of the Machinists Union for 35 years. My mother worked at the Mount Vernon Bakery. I graduated from high school at 17 and joined the Navy about 3 weeks later. I went in to see the recruiter. This was back in 1974, and we had a bit of a recession, and I was trying to find a summer job. I had a good construction job the previous summer. At that time, I did not get to drive a bulldozer as a 16-year-old, but I did get to clean the mud off the tracks at the end of the day. And I thought if I could ever have an opportunity to drive a bulldozer, that'd be pretty cool. So I went in to see the Navy recruiter, and I said, I know this is the Navy, but do you have any opportunities for guys to drive a bulldozer? And he kind of laughed, and he said, yeah, that would be the Seabees, a construction battalion. I can get you in there, but you have to wait 6 months before you go to boot camp. Well, when you're 17 years old, 6 months is a lifetime. I thought, no, I don't want to wait 6 months. What do you have that I can do now? And he said, well, I can get you into navigation. You'd go to boot camp in 3 weeks. So I said, that sounds great. 3 weeks later, I was off to boot camp and served on board the USS Chicago, a guided missile cruiser in the Western Pacific.
Could you turn down my TV?
Tours overseas, patrolling the Western Pacific. After after the Navy, I went to the University of Iowa and graduated in journalism. I worked for about 16 years as a reporter in Colorado and Iowa. I left the news business in 2008, which gave me an opportunity to volunteer in politics, which is something I'd always been interested in. So I volunteered for Stacey Apple when she ran for Congress, and Leonard Boswell when he was running for re-election. I volunteered for Barack Obama in 2012, and I was a precinct captain for Martin O'Malley in 2016. So when the opportunity for someone to take on Joni Ernst arose, or was in the offing, I kind of hang back and see if somebody like Tom Vilsack or Sally Peterson or Janet Peterson, our Senate Minority Leader right now, or Mike Gronstall, the former Senate Majority Leader, if any of those folks had got in, I could have supported any of them, and I think they would have done very well. I was a little surprised that none of those folks got in, and no one from the legislature got in. And as far as I know, none of the candidates who are running for the United States Senate, the opportunity to take on Joni Ernst, have had held elective office before. So there's a number of critical issues that we can get into, and I'd be happy to take any and all questions on that. And yeah, with that, I'd be happy to take any questions, Gloria.
Okay, great. Leslie, you were going to start.
Sure. Hi, Cal. My name is Leslie. My name is Leslie Nesmith, and welcome. And so glad you could be here this evening.
Thank you.
First question that we've got for you is, what, in your opinion, are the three most important issues for Iowans today? And how do you plan to address these issues?
Right. Okay. Number one has got to be healthcare. You know, we had Democrats had the House, the Senate, and the White House after Barack Obama was elected in 2009 and 2010. We took 2 years to pass a healthcare plan, and we still ended up with a healthcare system that provides too much opportunity for the insurance industry to take away money from our healthcare system. About 20 cents of our healthcare dollar goes to insurance companies because they have to pay for marketing and advertising and salespeople and CEO salaries. David Wickman, the CEO of United Healthcare, made $18 million in salary and bonuses in 2018. And that comes, if you have United Healthcare for your healthcare provider, that comes right out of our premiums. So if we have, and I like the idea of a public option, but if we have universal healthcare, Medicare for all, single payer, I like the public option because we didn't have to outlaw the horse and buggy. We just found more efficient ways to get around. And likewise, I don't think we have to outlaw private health insurance or say you can't compete with Medicare, but we outcompete private health insurance companies. Because if we have universal healthcare or single payer or public option, we won't have to pay those marketing costs, those advertising costs that insurance companies pay. We won't have to pay salespeople salaries. We won't have to pay CEO multi-millions of dollars to oversee private health insurance. And we won't have shareholders who expect a profit of return on their investment like we have with private healthcare insurance companies. So I think we have an opportunity to outcompete private healthcare with universal healthcare public option system. Another 30 cents of our healthcare dollar goes to administrative costs. You may have read about this hospital in North Carolina at Duke University. They have 900 beds at the hospital, over 1,000 billing clerks. These are folks who are doing the red tape shuffle with doctors and nurses and insurance companies to provide all the documentation. And sometimes that documentation is rejected by the insurance company or they ask for more. So these 1,000 folks at Duke University, it's probably not that unusual from hospitals all over the country. They're spending way too much time and way too much money identifying, documenting the costs that the doctors and nurses are submitting to the insurance company. And other countries, other developed nations where they have universal health care, that's not an expense. So we can eliminate 20 cents that goes to insurance companies, 30 cents that we're wasting on administrative costs, and another 12 cents of our healthcare dollar goes to the amount that we overpay for prescription drugs compared to most of our friends in other developed nations, 12 cents on the dollar. So once you look at 20 cents that goes to insurance companies, 30 cents on administrative costs, and 12 cents on the dollar for the amount we overpay for pharmaceuticals, we've already spent 62 cents of our healthcare dollar before we get to the doctors and nurses and CNAs who actually take care of us when we get sick or hurt. I was naive. I thought doctors and nurses spend almost all their day taking care of patients. I had lunch with a retired physician the other day, and she told me when she was still in practice that on some days she would spend nearly half of her day filling out paperwork to justify charges to the insurance company. What a waste of money. We waste about $600 billion a year on those administrative costs and insurance-related costs. $600 billion would cover all the 20-some million Americans who are now either uninsured or underinsured, and all those folks who don't have insurance and have pre-existing conditions. So we have a lot of opportunity without adding any more money to our healthcare system, just modifying how that money is spent. We can have a system comparable to the best healthcare in any of the other developed nations. And that's something we can achieve if we have the political will to send the right people to Washington. And instead of taking 2 years to come up with a healthcare plan, like we did with the Affordable Care Act in 2010, we had to do it in the first 180 days. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Many of our friends in the other developed countries, they already have good healthcare systems. We need to learn from them, adapt what works, leave behind what doesn't. We can have a healthcare system that works for every American. And we can do that if we have the political will to send the right people to Washington. Number 2 has to be our climate crisis. We are facing the worst climate conditions that we have since human beings started walking on the planet. The highest levels of carbon dioxide in 800,000 years. And we've already seen the results of this. People say, well, when is this climate crisis going to start? I had a conversation with my sister just recently, and she was asking me, well, what is this going to happen 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years down the road? I said, no, Roberta, this is happening now. We've already lost thousands of Americans in hurricanes Harvey, Katrina, Sandy, Andrew. We lost more than 80 Americans in the record California wildfires last year. Australia just lost more than 24 Australians in their worst ever wildfires, brush fires in this past season. And they estimate somewhere around 400 more people may have died as a result of respiratory problems brought on by the terrible air condition qualities after the wildfires in Australia. So this climate crisis is already happening. There's a island nation out in the Marshall Islands. Those folks now are just a few feet above sea level at high tide, or especially at king tide, or when they have storms. Already in some cases, their freshwater wells have been flooded by salt water, which ruins their wells. Their taro fields, taro is the main staple food for a lot of folks in the Pacific Islands. If those taro fields get flooded by salt water, they're in serious trouble. And they're already wondering, if we as a nation get flooded out, where do we go? Do we still have fishing rights? Are we still a nation? Do we have a seat at the UN? These are very real questions that people are already grappling with today. We need to address our climate crisis with a real sense of urgency now. And those two issues are the big reasons I got in this race. I want to see a candidate, as a voter, I want to see a candidate who's addressing these issues with passion and a real sense of urgency, and it's not just for our generation, it's for our kids, our grandkids, and the generation after that. If we don't address this climate crisis now with a real sense of urgency, they're going to see some things that we do not want them to see. Things get really ugly. Nobody would accuse our United States military of being a bunch of environmental tree huggers. I think we can agree on that, right? Nonetheless, our United States military is already preparing contingency plans for the eventuality not of millions, but tens of millions of climate refugees. People who've been forced out of their homes because of flooding, people who've been forced off of their farms because of drought or other severe weather conditions. It's what the military calls a threat multiplier. If you take what is already an unstable region of the world and add in all these climate threats through increasing temperatures, drought, fires, floods, it's a threat multiplier, and they're preparing for the eventuality, because this is what they do, of tens of millions of climate refugees in unstable regions of the world. Our climate crisis is already upon us. We need to address that a real sense of urgency, and now. So how do we do that? Well, we're already funding the fossil fuel industry with about $26 billion a year in welfare payments so they can continue doing what they do. We ought to phase out those $26 billion in welfare payments to the fossil fuel industry, to coal, gas, and oil, and phase in more research and development on solar and wind. Iowa is a leader in wind technology. We are second only to Texas in the amount of electricity that we generate from the wind. 40% of our electricity in Iowa now comes from wind turbines. And on a per square mile basis, we're number one, but we're behind Texas and ahead of every other state. We're still have a lot of work to do in solar, but I was recently out in southern Utah and southern Nevada, and they have vast fields, hundreds of acres of solar panels. Some of the states, in California as well, some of the states are already generating about 12 to 15% of their energy needs from solar. So between solar and wind, oh, and by the way, fun fact, at any time, the sun showers us with about 173,000 trillion watts of energy, which is 10,000 times the amount of energy that all the human beings on the planet are using at any one time. So between solar and wind and biomass and biogas and hydro, we can supply, once we get the technology developed, we can supply all the energy that everybody needs on the planet and phase out as fast as we can gas, coal, and oil. And that's the other second big reason that I got into this race. And if you'll indulge me for just a minute more, we have a crisis in rural America, in rural Iowa in particular. No thanks to Joni Ernst and President Trump, who gave renewable fuel standard waivers to 85 refineries around the country. Waivers that said they don't have to blend ethanol in with their gasoline. So those waivers were intended for small refineries if they had a financial hardship, but the Trump administration, the EPA, was giving them out to like candy to about anybody asked, including the large refineries, the Chevrons and the Exxons, and that hurt rural America to the tune of we lost about 1.4, demand for 1.4 billion bushels of corn, which probably had an economic impact of somewhere around $4 billion to America's farmers and rural communities, and that hurt our rural communities. And where was Joni Ernst for all this? Not to be seen, nary a whimper. And then when it comes to Donald Trump's ill-thought-out, ill-advised, and poorly executed trade tariffs with China and even our friends in Canada and Mexico, that hurt farmers to the tune of about another $10 billion, which has an immediate effect on our rural communities. So there's a lot we can do for our rural communities. We have to enforce those renewable fuel standards. We have to get rid of these poorly thought out trade tariffs. And maybe you remember talking to some of your grandparents or great grandparents. 100 years ago, a lot of rural areas still did not have electricity. And they came up with the REC because it's very expensive to put down electric lines from one farm to the next if they were 2 or 3 miles apart. So they came up with the REC and they fronted the money to electrify rural America. And now those farmers are much more competitive. We have a similar problem 100 years later with broadband. There's still a lot of rural areas in America that don't yet have broadband. And it's what they need to be competitive in the marketplace. And we can help those folks get broadband very, very much the same way that we helped rural America get electrified 100 and some years ago. So we have a lot of issues to work on. We've got to elect someone to the United States Senate who will fight for those issues. I thank you for your question, and I'd be happy to take any other questions or challenges that anyone may have.
Thanks, Cal.
Thank you, Leslie.
Okay, Linda, you were gonna ask the next question. Make sure you're unmuted.
Whoop, there we go. Thank you, Gloria.
Hi, Linda.
Hi, thanks for your responses. Those are two issues, climate change and health insurance, close to my heart. I pay just under $1,200 a month for my health insurance for myself. So it's
Crazy. And too much of that healthcare dollar is going to someone other than doctors and nurses.
yeah. And I can pay it. It certainly makes a big impact in my budget as far as what I can spend on other things, but I feel bad for the people who go without because they can't pay it.
Absolutely.
Anyway, my question to you is, how will your message resonate among Iowans with different political views? What are your strategies for bringing Iowans together, motivating people, especially younger people, to come out and vote for you?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I appreciate that. And oftentimes the political, hold on one second. I'm sorry. Got to shut my phone off. My bad. Okay. A lot of times the political pendulum swings from one extreme to another. We went from George W. Bush to Barack Obama, which was a pretty significant difference, regardless of where your politics lie. We went from Barack Obama clear to the other extreme with Donald Trump. And I think that with this election in 2020, we have an opportunity to swing the pendulum back away from Donald Trump and his strategy of bigotry and racism and divisiveness and intolerance to a more inclusive, more tolerant, patient, kind, loving kind of scenario. We're not always going to agree with folks on the other side of the aisle, but I think we can find some common ground. I don't know, maybe some of you folks are old enough to remember Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, even though they were philosophically miles apart, they found some common ground. They were able to get together and enjoy each other's company and find some common ground to move America forward. Bill Clinton did that with Newt Gingrich when he was president. Philosophically miles apart, but even Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich could get together, respect each other, and try to find some common ground on behalf of the American people. So I think we can do that. There are some issues that are not necessarily polarizing left or right issues. Everybody wants clean water. Everybody wants clean air. Everybody wants good schools. Everybody wants to have a vibrant economy. I think if we appeal to our friends, and I call them our friends, some of my best friends are Trump people, and I love them as much as ever. I don't always understand them, but I love them as much as ever. So I think if we appeal to the things that we have in common, the things that we care about, clean air, water, and good schools, and vibrant economies, we can appeal to those folks. I talked a little bit earlier when we were talking about agriculture issues about the renewable fuel standard and broadband. And I think those, if you live in a rural area, whether you're left, right, Republican, Democrat, whatever you are, you want to have access to high-speed internet. You want to have a vibrant community. You want to have a situation where if people are working in the community full-time, 40, sometimes 45, 50 hours a week, they ought to be making a living wage. And I think we can all agree that we want everybody who's willing to get out there and work full-time, they ought to be making a living wage. They ought to have good health care. And I think if we appeal to our friends and neighbors, regardless of their political ideology on those grounds, we can make some progress. And I have to say, we Democrats have some work to do. We did not do very well. We picked up a couple seats in the House in 2018, in spite of the fact that we did not do very well in some of the rural areas. And I really plan to be focusing on those rural areas and talking about the things that we can do to help reinvigorate those rural areas, make sure those hospitals stay open, make sure those schools have the funding they need to teach our kids, because the kids, you know, are our future. And if we value our kids, we value our future, we've got to value education, because that's a big part of our success. So we've got to make sure that we're looking out for folks with regards to clean air, clean water, education, and vibrant communities.
Okay, our last question, and then we maybe will have 5-10 minutes left for opening up for anybody else, is, so there's 5 candidates.
Mhm.
And what we don't pick a candidate within our group, but we are all wanting a candidate that can beat Joni Ernst. So how would you distinguish yourself from the other candidates who can, number one, beat Joni Ernst and then represent Iowans and work effectively? I think you kind of addressed that a little bit.
Right.
Work effectively with the Senate.
You know, I mentioned earlier a little bit about why I decided to get into this race. And if I had heard with a sense of urgency and passion and determination the things that are important to me as a voter last summer, I would not have gotten into this race. But we have to elect someone with a sense of urgency and specificity and detail about what they would do about our climate crisis and our healthcare crisis. I know there's a tendency sometimes in a race to say as little as possible in the primary, hopeful that if you get the nomination, they won't have, your opponent on the Republican side won't have issues to use against you. I don't think this is any time to keep your head down and get along and go along in Washington. This is a time to stand up for critical issues that we all have to fight for. And I wasn't seeing what I needed to see as a voter last summer on those issues when I got into this race. And that's why I got into this race, with a sense of urgency and passion and determination to fight for our climate, to fight for our planet, to fight for our healthcare system.
Okay, great. So yeah, I think we've got about 10 more minutes if anybody wants to ask questions.
I'll take any and all, and if anybody wants
I
to
have a follow-up.
debate, go ahead, please.
So with your rural background and talking to some people around the state and rural areas, do you think that the climate change, you know, taking care of the earth message and the universal health care message, I would think that appeals to farmers because they don't have health care, they pay a lot for it, and they do care about their land. So do you think that is a way for Democrats to connect more with the rural?
It is absolutely a way to do that. And you're right, a lot of times farmers, if they're not employed, and in a lot of situations, one spouse works on the farm and one spouse works in town, so they have health care, but not everybody has a spouse and not everybody is able to have that kind of scenario. Without universal health care, it's also a disincentive for someone, if they have an entrepreneurial spirit, if they have a great business idea. It's tough to leave your job if you have health care for you and your spouse and maybe your kids, and to become an entrepreneur because you have to give up your healthcare system. If we have healthcare for all, it will encourage entrepreneurs and people with a great business idea. And maybe they've saved up some money to start a business. If we have universal healthcare, that healthcare goes with them, whether they're working, whether they're starting a business, regardless of what they do. It's one more argument for universal healthcare, to have healthcare for all. And absolutely, our rural communities would benefit from that greatly as well. So you're absolutely right about that. It's one more argument for having healthcare for all, that is not dependent on your job. And so you don't have a disincentive for leaving your job if you have a good reason to do that. Excellent question.
And then what do you hear from farmers on the climate change topic?
You know, a lot of farmers are concerned about that. They say, well, you're going to drive me out of business if you move ahead with your climate change plans. And to the contrary, I've driven a lot of country roads in the last 6 months until the whole COVID-19 pandemic put the kibosh on campaigning in person. And I was really surprised by the number of solar panels that I had seen on farms, and especially right outside hog confinements, where they've got a little patch of land that they're not going to be plowing up and planting crops there. I'm surprised and pleased by the number of solar panels that I've seen on farms. As we mentioned, wind turbines. We've got wind turbines all over the state of Iowa. We're number 2 in the amount of energy that we generate from wind turbines. And there's a couple of Iowans. Maybe you're familiar with Matt Russell and Bob Leonard. They had an op-ed in the New York Times about a year ago, and they were talking about what we need to do to address the issues of both climate change and helping rural communities. And one of the things that they mentioned is for a few pennies a meal, we can incentivize farmers to do the right thing. And what does that look like? It means planting cover crops so we can sequester more carbon on and in the land. It means leaving more stover on the field, that's the corn stalks and other carbon-based material, leaving it on the field longer. Having crop rotation, like my dad did, about 60 years ago. That was pretty common among farmers back through the, I'd say the first 2/3 of the 20th century, that you have crop rotation, which lends itself very much to sequestering more carbon on the land and not so much in our atmosphere. And the other thing that they've talked about quite a bit is the importance of getting livestock back on the land, because grazing hogs or putting hogs out back into the fields to pick up corn and whatever else they can find out there, and grazing cattle can actually do some things to stimulate new growth of plants and carbon-based materials if we properly manage getting livestock back on the land. So those 4 things we've talked about all can benefit farmers. And I think farmers would like to be fellow soldiers in this battle for our climate, and they certainly can be. Farmers don't have to be the bad guy. They can be fellow soldiers in this battle to take on our climate crisis. And we have all kinds of incentives for farming now. We just had the bailout because a lot of farmers had some hard times because of Trump's ill-advised tariffs. And so if we just incentivize farmers to do the right thing, we can make them fellow soldiers in this fight to save our climate and our planet.
Great, thank you.
I have a question. You had said everybody can agree upon the need for clean water, and yet we have a real problem in Iowa with the Republican legislators that keeps getting voted in to even fund clean water in the DNR that we have previously agreed to. So how can you say that that's a universal, how do you overcome that?
No, that's a really good question. And I think we can agree that we all want to have clean water. The question is, what are we prepared to pay to have that clean water? And you're absolutely right. To this point, we have had a legislature that has not been serious about cleaning up our waterways. Our rivers and creeks and streams should not be open sewers. They should not be fair game to dump any chemicals in there. We have way too much chemical agriculture. And that's, again, part of the reason that we need to get back to a more regenerative kind of farming system with some assistance for farmers, that we can get back to that kind of a system. I understand your concern, and our legislature gets about a D- or an F when it comes to protecting our waterways. The question is, and I think we're going to make some progress this fall. I don't know if we'll have success in taking back both houses of the Iowa legislature, but I think we're going to make some progress. We just have to shout it from the rooftops that clean water is important, and we have to put our vote and our money where our mouth is and say we're going to stand up for those candidates who promise to fight for clean water. And here in Des Moines, we've got one of the most expensive nitrate removal systems in the world to try and remove the nitrates that are coming downstream that we eventually have to convert into our drinking water. So we have a ways to go, but we've got to stand up at every opportunity and support those candidates who say they will fight for clean air and fight for clean water.
So I have a question. Hi, Cal. This is Diane Wiesenfeld. What opportunities have you had to connect with younger voters? How do you motivate them? What's going to get people to the polls that we really need to support a progressive platform?
I've been very impressed with the activism that I've seen from young folks. I'm old enough to remember what the 60s were like, and I think I've seen more activism from young folks than I have since any time in the 1960s. Greta Thunberg, the young lady who's a real advocate, a passionate advocate for our climate, was Times Person of the Year. And she's, 16 years old? She's doing TED Talks. She's just one example of the thousands, maybe millions of young folks who are getting involved in our our climate action teams, the Sunrise Movement. There's a number of Citizens Climate Lobby. I've seen a lot of activism from young folks, and these are campaigns where young folks are not necessarily just following, but they're leading. After some of the school shootings, there's a lot of young folks who, at Parkland and other places, a lot of young folks have taken it upon themselves to advocate for more school safety with regards to gun safety in our schools. And I'm very impressed to see those young folks out there. You know, we had all kinds of presidential candidates coming through Iowa for the last more than a year, up until the Iowa caucuses, up until caucus night. And I had the opportunity to talk with many young folks who are working on those campaigns in their teens and early 20s. And these folks are very passionate, very concerned about our climate and school safety. So I'm very impressed with the activism that I'm seeing with young folks. And I think they're prepared to, this is a new generation of kids, and I think they're preparing themselves to get involved yet again. So I'm very encouraged by that.
Nancy, do you have, Nancy, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I guess I'm interested in early childhood and women's health issues, and wanted to know what kinds of things are you going to do, or what's on your agenda in under early childhood, maybe financing some of those things that are needed, especially in the rural areas where lots of people are working and there isn't a lot of health, childcare, and also the women's health issues.
Yep. Well, American prosperity depends on the opportunity for parents to go to work. Unfortunately, it's not always a situation where one parent makes enough to go to work and provide for the rest of the family. So we have to have opportunities with healthcare, because as I mentioned before, these kids are our future. If we go back to a tax system, and I'm not suggesting, well, none of you are old enough to remember Dwight Eisenhower, but maybe you've probably read about him. Under Dwight Eisenhower, we had a top marginal tax rate of 90%. I'm not suggesting, that's for folks who are probably making in the millions of dollars now. I'm not suggesting we need to go back to a 90% marginal tax rate, but if we just go back to 2/3 of what it was under Dwight Eisenhower, and the roof didn't cave in, the economy didn't go bust, we had a very prosperous economy for the most part under Dwight Eisenhower, with the top marginal tax rate of 90%. And with the top capital gains tax rate, you know, Trump just lowered that for the millionaires and billionaires. Under those other left-wing radicals, and I'm being facetious, Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, the top marginal tax rate, or excuse me, capital gains tax rate was 35%. It's now down to 22% thanks to Trump. That tax cut that we had in 2017 was a big sloppy wet kiss to the millionaires and billionaires. We essentially took out $1 trillion loan, this is all before COVID-19, to give millionaires and billionaires a tax break. If we repeal the Trump tax cuts of 2017 and go back to the tax rate, just 2/3 of what we had under Eisenhower for the marginal tax rate, and what we had under Ford and Nixon for our top capital gains tax rate, we can have the money to provide programs for kids. I think it's maybe more important that we ensure we're funding early childhood education more so than college programs. It's so critical to kids who are 4, 5, 6 years old to get off to a good start. Much of their academic success, and therefore their career success, depends on good reading skills when they're 4, 5, and 6 years old. So we can't spend enough making sure that those kids get off to a good start, get a good education, and on their way to having a good academic career. So I don't have an exact number for you, but I know that it's got to be a priority. If we care about the future of our nation, our economic development, our economic vitality, we have to ensure that those kids are getting off to a good start with education and with childcare.
And what about women's health?
Go ahead.
Well, I think women's health is health for this country. We have to have an opportunity for every American to have quality, affordable health care. The folks up at Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, and the folks over in, what's the prestigious hospital over in Maryland? In any event, those folks got to excellence in healthcare because somebody decided that that was important. And I think we can do that again. We have a lot of work to do in our healthcare system, but if we realign our healthcare system and our tax policy, we can have the money to fund women's healthcare, children's healthcare, healthcare for every American, and I'm committed. I think that's a great idea. If you have some more specifics, I would welcome your suggestions and ideas on that.
Okay, I'm gonna stop the taping just because I want to keep this. People's attention spans are short these days.
Sure.
So I'm gonna go ahead and close, but I will, if you guys want to stay on and ask more questions of Gal, I will leave it on, but I'm gonna wrap up the taping portion, okay? So I'll end this by saying anybody that's joined us and watched us, first of all, thanks to all the members for showing up and for caring. I love you all. And the other thing is just to remind people, the primary is coming up on June 2nd. Educate yourself, get your ballot so you can vote by mail. You don't have to do the coronavirus. So thank you so much.
Thank you all for the opportunity. Thanks, Gloria.
Thanks very much.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate